To escape the ghost of his dead dog, grieving widower Silas Croft adopted a companion he could never replace, a silent, wild bobcat. He expected a wild soul to match his own lonely wilderness. But when the bobcat began acting just like the dog he had lost, he confronted an impossible, heartwarming secret. The silence was the loudest thing in the cabin. Silas Croft, 72 years old, knew its shape. He knew its weight. It sat in the chair opposite him. It slept in the empty half of his bed. It was a constant, heavy companion in the vast Wyoming wilderness. The sun rose. It painted the mountain peaks in hues of orange and rose. Silas watched it from his porch. He held a mug of black coffee. A second mug, clean and unused, sat on the small table beside him. It was Clara's mug. It always would be. His day began. The routine was a shield. It was a dam against the flood of memory. Chop wood. Check the fence line. Eat a solitary lunch. Read a book he'd read a dozen times before. The pages were worn soft, like an old blanket. Each action was a ghost of a former life. He'd chopped wood with his dog, Buddy, lying in the sun nearby. A big, goofy golden Labrador with a heart full of dumb, unconditional love. He'd checked the fences with Clara, her hand in his, her laughter a melody against the whisper of the pines. Now, there was only the wind. Clara had been gone for 2 years. A sickness that came fast and took everything. Buddy had followed her 6 months ago. Old age had finally claimed him. He'd simply laid his head in Silas's lap and gone to sleep. The vet said it was peaceful. Silas knew it was just another piece of his world breaking away. He couldn't get another dog. The thought was a physical pain, a hot poker in his chest. To see another tail wagging by the door, to hear the click of different claws on the floorboards. It would be a betrayal, a lie. He would spend his remaining time comparing, remembering, and grieving all over again. No, he would face the silence alone. But the silence was winning. It was a creeping frost, seeping into his bones. The loneliness was no longer a dull ache. It was a sharp, biting thing. It gnawed at him in the dead of night. It made the cabin feel less like a home and more like a tomb. One crisp autumn morning, he found himself driving. He didn't know where he was going at first. The truck just seemed to know the way. He passed the turnoff for the town, for the grocery store. He kept driving deeper into the mountains until he saw the sign. Clear Creek Wildlife Sanctuary. A second chance for the wild. He pulled in. He didn't know why. It was a foolish idea. An old man's desperate whim. He got out of the truck. The air here was different. It was filled with sounds. The caw of a raven. The distant howl of a coyote. The low chuffing of something big and unseen. It wasn't the silence. It was life. A woman in a khaki shirt and kind eyes met him at the main building. Her name tag read Dr. Anya Sharma. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her voice was gentle. Silas felt the foolishness of his quest settle on him like a shroud. "I don't know," he mumbled. "I live alone. My wife and my dog, they're gone." The words were hard. They felt like stones in his throat. "The house is too quiet." Dr. Sharma nodded. She didn't offer pity. She offered understanding. Sometimes the quiet is the hardest part. "Are you looking for volunteer opportunity?" "No," Silas said, the word coming out faster than he intended. "A companion." Her eyebrows raised slightly. "We aren't a pet shelter, Mr. Croft." "Silas Croft." "I know. I can't get another dog. I thought I'd look." She studied him for a long moment. She saw the deep lines of grief etched around his eyes. She saw the tremor in his hand. She saw a man at the edge of a precipice. "We have some permanent residents," she said slowly. "Animals that can be released. Usually, they require very specific care. They are not pets, Mr. Croft." "I understand," he said. He didn't, not really. But he needed to see. She led him past large enclosures. A lame wolf watched them with intelligent yellow eyes. A hawk with a damaged wing sat regally on its perch. Then, they stopped before a pen set slightly apart from the others. Inside, a bobcat was grooming itself on a sun-drenched rock. It was a creature of breathtaking beauty, a mosaic of tawny gold, brown, and black spots. It had tufted ears that twitched at the slightest sound and eyes the color of pale green jade. It moved with a liquid grace that spoke of contained power. It was wildness made flesh. But there was something else, a stillness, a solitude. The other animals seemed restless, pacing their confines. This one seemed at peace with its isolation. It looked up, its gaze meeting Silas's. There was no fear, no aggression, just a calm, quiet assessment. In those wild eyes, Silas saw a reflection of his own soul. He saw a creature that had been set apart, that lived within its own circle of silence. "His name is Kale," Dr. Sharma said softly. "He's been here about a year. He's unusual, very quiet, keeps to himself." "What's his story?" Silas asked, his voice a whisper. "He's a permanent resident. He can't be released. He wouldn't survive." Silas stood there for a long time. He watched the bobcat. Kale watched him back. A silent conversation passed between them, a recognition of shared loneliness. "I'll take him," Silas said. Dr. Sharma blinked. "Mr. Croft, I don't think you understand. He's a bobcat. He's a predator. This is not a house cat." "I have land," Silas said, his voice firm now, resolute. "Miles of it. Fenced. My cabin is secure. I'm not a fool. I know what he is. But I also know what I see." He looked from the doctor to the cat. "He's alone. So am I." The process was long and complicated. There were forms, inspections of his property, stern warnings. Dr. Sharma was thorough. She was protecting the animal, and she was protecting the old man from his own strange impulse. But Silas was determined. He reinforced his doors. He secured his windows. He proved he understood the risks. He was offering a home, not a cage. A shared solitude, not a pet's life. Finally, the day came. Dr. Sharma and 2 staff members arrived with a large crate. They brought Kale into the cabin. They opened the door. Kale stepped out. He was not a kitten. He was 40 pounds of coiled muscle and instinct. He surveyed the room. His nose twitched, taking in 1,000 new scents. The old wood, the cold fireplace, the lingering ghost of a dog, the scent of a grieving man. He walked the perimeter of the main room. His padded feet made no sound. He was a shadow moving through the space. Silas sat in his armchair, perfectly still, his heart thudding against his ribs. The sanctuary staff quietly let themselves out, leaving the 2 of them alone. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was not empty. It was filled with a watchful presence. The first few days were a delicate dance. Silas moved slowly. He spoke in a low, calm voice. He left food out. A bowl of raw, high-quality meat Dr. Sharma had prescribed. Kale ate only when Silas was in another room. He spent most of his time on the high mantelpiece above the fireplace, a living statue with unblinking eyes. Silas didn't try to touch him. He didn't call to him. He simply lived, allowing the wild creature to acclimate. He read his book. He drank his coffee. He talked to Clara's picture. "Well, Clara," he'd murmur, "I've done it now. Brought a blasted bobcat into the house. You'd call me an old fool." He imagined her laugh. It made the cabin feel a little warmer. Then, the strange things began to happen. It started a weekend. Silas was preparing his own dinner. A simple steak and some potatoes. He set his plate on the table. He turned to get a glass of water. Usually, this was when Kale would slink from his perch to his own food bowl. But he didn't. Silas sat down. He looked over. Kale was sitting by the hearth. He was watching Silas, not with a predator's hunger, but with a patient stillness. It was odd. Silas picked up his fork and took a bite. He ate another. He finished half his meal. Only then did Kale rise, stretch languidly, and walk to his own bowl to eat. Silas froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. It was a small thing, a tiny deviation, but it was familiar. Buddy used to do that. He'd always wait for Silas to start eating before he would touch his own food. A pack behavior, a sign of respect for the alpha. Coincidence, Silas muttered to himself. Just a coincidence. A few nights later, a storm rolled in. Rain lashed against the windows. The wind howled like a hungry wolf. Silas was stoking the fire. He felt a presence behind him. He turned. Kale was standing at the back door. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't crying. He lifted a single, padded paw and scratched at the wood. A soft, deliberate scrape. Once. Twice. Silas's blood ran cold. That was Buddy's signal. Not a frantic scratching, but a polite request. One that meant he needed to go out. A bobcat had no reason to do that. It would simply answer nature's call where it stood if it had to. This was a learned, domestic behavior. Feeling like he was in a dream, Silas opened the door. Kale trotted out onto the covered porch, did his business in the corner near the woodpile, and then scratched at the door to be let back in. Silas stared. The wind and rain didn't seem real. The only real thing was the bobcat that was acting like a dog. He let it back in. Cale shook the rain from his coat, just like Buddy would have, and went to lie by the fire. The coincidences were piling up. They were building into something that felt impossible. The ultimate sign came a month after Cale's arrival. It was Clara's birthday. The grief, always simmering beneath the surface, boiled over. Silas didn't chop wood that day. He didn't check the fences. He sat in his armchair, a faded photograph of his wife in his hands. Her smile beamed up at him. Young, vibrant, alive. A tear slid down his weathered cheek. Then another. Soon, his shoulders were shaking with silent, racking sobs. The dam had broken. The loneliness was a vast, dark ocean, and he was drowning in it. He didn't notice the soft padding of feet on the wooden floor. He didn't see the green eyes watching him, full of a strange, unreadable emotion. He felt a gentle nudge against his leg. He looked down. Cale was standing there, and in his mouth, held delicately, was one of Silas's old, worn leather slippers. He dropped it softly on Silas's boot. He looked up at him, and for the first time, Cale made a sound directed at him. Not a hiss or a growl. A low, vibrating chuff. A sound of inquiry, of comfort. The world stopped. The air left Silas's lungs. The photograph slipped from his fingers. Buddy. That was Buddy's move. Every single time Silas had been sad, or sick, or just quiet, Buddy would retrieve his slipper. He'd bring it as a gift. An offering. A furry, slobbery cure for a broken heart. A bobcat could not know this. It was impossible. It was a gesture so specific, so deeply personal, that it defied all logic. It was a message from a ghost, delivered by a wildcat. Silas reached out a trembling hand. He didn't think. He just acted. He laid his hand on Cale's head, between the tufted ears. The fur was thick and soft. Cale didn't flinch. He leaned into the touch, just for a second, and chuffed again. The sobs stopped. They were replaced by a profound, earth-shattering confusion. He looked at the slipper on his foot. He looked at the bobcat, now settling by his chair. This wasn't a wild animal. Not entirely. This was something else. Something more. His hand shook as he reached for the phone. He dialed the number for the sanctuary. It rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. Clear Creek, Dr. Sharma speaking. Doctor, Silas said, his voice hoarse. It's Silas Croft. Silas, is everything all right? Is Cale okay? There was a note of immediate concern in her voice. He's fine. I'm not sure I am. He took a deep breath. I need to ask you about him. You said he was unusual. You said he couldn't survive in the wild. You never told me why. There was a pause on the other end of the line. It's a complicated story, Silas. Is there a problem? No. Yes. I don't know. He stammered, feeling like a madman. My bobcat is acting like a dog. My dog. My dead dog. He recounted the events. The waiting for dinner. The scratching at the door. And finally, the impossible story of the slipper. He told it all, his voice cracking with a mix of awe and disbelief. He expected her to tell him he was a lonely old man, seeing patterns that weren't there. He expected her to be skeptical. Instead, there was another long silence. When she finally spoke, her voice was full of a soft, sad wonder. Oh, Silas, she said, I should have told you the whole story. I just didn't think it was relevant. Cale isn't just a bobcat. What do you mean? His name wasn't always Cale, Dr. Sharma began, her voice taking on a storyteller's cadence. For the first 2 years of his life, his name was Patches. She told him the story. A wildfire had swept through a section of the national forest. A mother bobcat had been lost. A forest ranger, surveying the damage, found a single, tiny, smoke-stained kitten mewing pitifully near a scorched log. He was barely a week old, his eyes still sealed shut. He was an orphan, moment from death. The ranger knew a family on the edge of the forest. The Miller family. They were good people. More importantly, their golden Labrador, a gentle soul named Sadie, had just given birth to a litter of her own. It was a long shot, a crazy idea, but it was the kitten's only chance. He brought the tiny, spotted creature to the Millers. Sadie, her belly full of milk and her heart full of maternal instinct, didn't seem to notice the difference. She sniffed the strange-smelling kitten, gave it a rough, cleansing lick, and nudged it toward her teat alongside her own chubby, golden puppies. The bobcat kitten latched on. He survived. He grew up in a pile of Labradors, Silas, Dr. Sharma said. He was raised by a dog. He learned from a dog. He thought he was a dog. Silas sank back in his chair. The phone pressed hard against his ear. He looked at Kale, who was now dozing by the fire. A bobcat who thought he was a dog. He learned everything from Sadie and her pups. Dr. Sharma continued. He learned to wait his turn for food. He learned to ask to go outside. He learned how to play, how to socialize, how to be part of a pack. The Millers had a young son, and Patches, as they called him, was his best friend. They treated him like a slightly odd, incredibly athletic member of the family. What happened? Silas asked, his voice barely a whisper. Why did they give him up? Dr. Sharma's voice grew somber. He grew up. A Labrador puppy that gets too rough during play gives you a nip and a bruise. A bobcat who doesn't know his own strength is a different story. One day, he was playing fetch with the boy, a game he played 1,000 times. But he was bigger now, stronger. He leaped for the ball and accidentally knocked the child over. His claw, entirely by accident, caught the boy's arm. It wasn't a vicious act. It was a play accident. But the gash was deep. It required stitches. The Millers were heartbroken. They loved Patches, but they realized, with dawning horror, that they could no longer keep him. He wasn't a danger because he was mean. He was a danger because he was a bobcat. His wild nature, a nature he didn't even know he had, was reasserting itself physically. With tears in their eyes, they made the hardest decision of their lives and surrendered him to the sanctuary, begging them to find him a place where he could be safe. We named him Kale to give him a new start, Dr. Sharma finished. We tried to reintroduce him to other bobcats, but he didn't know how to interact. They were too aggressive for him. He was afraid. He didn't speak their language. He was a creature caught between two worlds. Too wild for the human world, too domesticated for the wild one. That's why he was so quiet and solitary here. He was grieving Silas. He lost his whole family. The call ended. Silas sat in the quiet cabin, the truth of it all washing over him. He looked at the sleeping animal. Kale wasn't just a bobcat. He was an orphan, a misfit, a creature whose heart had been shaped like a dog's, trapped in the body of a predator. He was grieving his first family, just as Silas was grieving his. The slipper wasn't a message from Buddy's ghost. It was a learned language of comfort, a behavior Kale had learned from his mother, Sadie, to soothe her human family. A profound understanding bloomed in Silas's chest. He hadn't just chosen a companion. He had been chosen. He was the one person, perhaps, who could understand. The one person who could give Kale what he needed. Not just a home, but both homes. The next morning, Silas was a man with a purpose. The fog of grief had lifted, replaced by a clear, driving mission. He drove to the lumberyard. He bought wire mesh, the thickest gauge they had. He bought posts and hinges and bags of concrete. The man at the counter raised an eyebrow. Building a fortress, Silas? Something like that, Silas said with a grin. It was the first time he'd grinned in months. For the next 2 weeks, he worked. He was 72, but he worked with the strength of a man half his age. He was fueled by more than coffee. He was fueled by love. He measured and dug. He mixed concrete and set posts. He stretched and secured the heavy mesh. He built a massive enclosure that ran from the back of his cabin deep into the woods. It was 50 yards long and 20 yards wide, a huge swath of forest now safely contained. He included trees for climbing, thickets for hiding, and a large, sunning rock in the center. He built a special, secure door that connected directly to the cabin's back room. It was a bobcat's paradise, a place for Kale to be Kale. When it was finished, Silas opened the new door. Kale, who had watched the entire construction with curious green eyes, padded cautiously to the threshold. He sniffed the air. He looked out at the slice of wilderness that was now his. He took a tentative step out, then another, and then he ran. He exploded into motion, a blur of tawny fur. He sprinted the length of the enclosure, his powerful legs eating up the ground. He leaped, launching himself effortlessly onto a low-hanging pine branch. He climbed high into the trees, a master of his vertical world. He stalked falling leaves and pounced on imaginary mice in the undergrowth. Silas watched, his heart swelling with a joy he thought he'd never feel again. He was watching the wild side of Kale come to life. The instincts that had been dormant were now free to be expressed safely. But the dog remained. Inside the cabin, Their routine continued. Cale still waited for Silas to eat first. He still scratched at the door, though now it was the door to his new kingdom. He spent his evenings not on the mantelpiece, but on the hearth rug, a warm and solid presence by the fire. He allowed Silas to scratch behind his tufted ears. He would lean into the touch and let out that low, rumbling chuff that was his unique sound of contentment. One evening, Silas found Buddy's old, slobbery tennis ball under the sofa. A pang of sadness hit him, but it was softer now. On a whim, he tossed it gently across the room. Cale's head snapped up. His instincts warred for a second. The predator and the retriever. The dog won. He pounced on the ball, batted it with his paws, and then, picking it up awkwardly in his mouth, he trotted it back and dropped it near Silas's feet. Silas laughed. A real, deep laugh that shook his whole body. Cale looked up, tilting his head as if to say, "Did I do it right?" "You did it right, boy," Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. "You did it just right." Their bond was forged in the space between two worlds. They were a pack of two, a lonely man and a bobcat who thought he was a dog. They filled the empty spaces in each other's lives. The silence in the cabin was gone forever. It was replaced by the soft pad of paws, the happy chuff of a strange friend, and the sound of an old man's laughter. A few months later, Silas called Dr. Sharma. "I have a strange request," he said. He asked for the Miller family's contact information. He wanted them to see Cale, to know he was okay. Dr. Sharma, after getting the family's permission, arranged it. One Saturday, a car pulled up the long driveway. A man, a woman, and a boy of about 10 got out. They looked nervous, anxious. Silas met them on the porch. "Thank you for coming," he said simply. "We had to," said the mother, her eyes already misty. "We think about him every day." We called him Patches. Silas led them inside. He had Cale in the cabin with him. The bobcat was lying by the fire. He lifted his head when the strangers entered. He stood up, his body tense. The Miller family froze at the door. They saw not a pet, but a full-grown, wild predator. The boy, whose arm bore a faint, silvery scar, hid behind his father. "It's okay," Silas said softly. "Just be still." Cale looked at the faces. His ears twitched. His nose worked, deciphering the familiar scents. He took a hesitant step forward, then another. He walked right up to the boy. The boy flinched, but his father put a steadying hand on his shoulder. Cale stopped a foot away from him. He looked at the boy's face, and then he let out a low, familiar chuff. He nudged the boy's hand with his head, a gesture of pure, canine affection. The boy let out a choked sob. "Patches," he whispered. He reached out a trembling hand and stroked Cale's back. "It's him. He remembers me." Tears streamed down the parents' faces. It was a reunion and a release. They saw their beloved, strange dog was not just alive, but happy. He was understood. He was home. They stayed for an hour, sharing stories of Cale's puppyhood, laughing at his goofy habits. When they left, it was with peace in their hearts. That evening, the sun set, painting the mountains in fire and gold. Silas sat on his porch. Cale lay at his feet, his head resting on Silas's boot. Inside, the unused coffee mug still sat on the table. The picture of Clara still smiled from the mantel. The ghosts were still there, but they weren't lonely ghosts anymore. They were part of the story, part of the family. Silas looked down at the beautiful, wild creature resting at his feet. A bobcat with a Labrador's soul. A testament to the idea that family isn't about blood or species. It's about love. A love that could bridge worlds, heal a broken heart, and finally, make the silence beautiful.